Good morning. This is January 20th. It's Martin Luther's birthday. It's also Trump's inauguration day. And while I want to stick to the topic of discussing international conflict, it is also the case that many of you probably didn't bother listening, but I spent the morning listening to it all. And I must confess, I'm feeling quite rattled by it all, even though there was nothing terribly new. Let me start by saying that we are living in a world of conflict. 22 countries are in conflict. At least a quarter of a million people are displaced. That's probably an understatement. There's lots going on in the world, but if you listen to our president, our golden age is about to start. We will do all kinds of things which have international implications, and of course, we are the most important and powerful country in the world, and we will, obviously not engage in any violence. I'll get to the topic in a minute, but we are taking back the Panama Canal, he says. Obviously, this will have to happen militarily, so we will be engaging in violence if he goes ahead. He's sending the military to the border to stop people from coming in. That could lead to some violence of different sorts. And he's going to round up at least 1 million alien criminals in the United States. By the way, crime statistics are down in the U.S. And how is he going to round them all up? Sending the military to Chicago? I don't think exactly this is legal. But then, we will be breaking with norms. And other countries might be forgiven to be quite scared and for thinking of us as maybe moving into a slightly fascist era, which, given the fact that we are such a powerful country, is of course very scary to people around the world who believe in democracy and or who are even critical of their own governments, which are turning somewhat more right-wing. So there's going to be not lots to talk about in 2025, and I think that it would be worth for a while. You probably have it recorded to at least listen to a little bit of the speech. So the reason I want to focus on violence today is because, of course, there's so much of it around. There are many people who are losing their lives. There are many people who are suffering from famine due to violence rather than just climate change. And there are lots of wars and conflicts going on. We listen to them in the news. I've actually talked to some of them before, but I mean, the obvious examples are Gaza, Syria. It's not clear yet what's going to happen, various parts in the Middle East, what's going to happen with Iran. But I actually want to also alert you to the fact that violence in various countries, which doesn't get any press, is spreading. So, for example, we get very little attention on the media and even the newspaper on what's going on in the Sudan. Sudan is not some tiny little pipsqueak country. It's got a population of about 50 million people. And the assumptions are that, even though there are no accurate statistics, that certainly several hundred million people have either been killed outright during the civil conflict that is still going on, and or have died of famine. And that, of course, raises another question. If one talks about conflict, is one only talking about military conflict, or if one is interested in the consequence of conflict, namely people are killed and people are maimed and people die of famine, are those different statistics that we don't need to pay, an awful lot of attention to. The thing that has gotten most attention, of course, is Gaza. And while the news out of Gaza in the last 24 hours has been positive, 3 hostages have been let go. If you look at the pictures of Gaza, roughly speaking, 70% of the place has been destroyed. It's true that people are arguing about, whether it's 47 million or 50 million or maybe up to 60 million people have been killed. But several, Gaza's total population was 2 million people, roughly speaking, a little more. And of those, at least another 100 million, 750,000, have been injured and maimed physically and psychologically. So the violence, I think one needs to talk about violence, not just in terms of the number of people who've actually been killed, but rather the people where the violence has impacted them in such a way that their capacity to lead normal lives has been eroded. And those statistics are, generally speaking, not given. There are, countries that have gotten very little attention. For example, Myanmar, right, which has expelled maybe 2.3 million people. Some hundreds of thousands have gotten killed. At the same time, there are about 1 million refugees in refugee camps in Bangladesh. So when you talk about these civil wars and civil conflicts, it is not just the people who are death statistics, but also the people who statistically are injured physically and mentally and will no longer have a capacity to lead a normal life. And that, generally speaking, does not figure into the statistics. Looking at this sort of softer side, if I may say so, if people are not outright killed, most of the agencies that collect statistics will point out that between 3.5 and 4 million people are in refugee status somewhere else. And the refugee status very often means camps, means on the run, means people die on the way, of famine, of injury, and so forth. So I could go through a little litany and bore you with all the places in the world where violence is taking place because governments are in a conflict and or are themselves having been invaded. And those statistics are very high right now. In addition to that, there are the statistics which very often are not so well collected, which are, for example, ISIS. You will recall who ISIS are, is now acting pretty much all over the world. For example, ISIS activities, military and violent activities, are going on in countries like Mozambique, in Africa, are going on in several countries in West Africa, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in several other countries, where on the one hand you have a government, but the government does not have the capacity to deal with the violence that ISIS produces by trying to take over villages and sections of the country and killing people right and left. So that the problem of violence in countries is not just the civil wars that we identify as civil wars, but the countries where in fact ISIS is operational, which is yet not as yet identified as civil wars, but where serious international violence and groups from around the world are very busy killing people, burning down villages, and so forth. We are dealing with a very violent period in world history, not at the level of a world war in which, nuclear weapons are raining down on people, but where a substantial number of people in the world, of the, billions of people that reside in the world, live in countries which either are engaged in violence in terms of civil conflict or are have violence taking place, which is not, random murders on the part of criminals, but serious violence on the part of groups, sometimes internal groups, but very often nowadays ISIS. Let me quickly put an asterisk to that, and you will remember the Wagner group, right? Which was active in any number of African countries. Well, Wagner head was killed, if you recall, and then the Wagner group was dispersed. So where are those former soldiers from the Wagner group? Well, some have gone back to Russia and joined Russia in its fight against the Ukraine, but others are sort of independent actors who've joined ISIS groups and so forth. In ancient times and literature, we would have referred to something like the Foreign Legion as having been active here and there. Now, the problem is, I can give you endless statistics and endless facts about various places that you may or may not care about, but it is a global phenomenon. And the global phenomenon is also enhanced, that is to say, violence, local groups, international groups, civil wars, external actors, and so forth, is also enhanced by a totally different topic, namely climate and climate change. By the way, that was not mentioned at all in Trump's inaugural address. In fact, he blamed the fires in Los Angeles on poor governance rather than having or even mentioning climate change in any way. While I'm on this topic, I'm sorry to switch topics again. We are back to drill baby drill, and Trump's policy is to extract and reopen and so forth oil and gas spigots. And so never mind climate change, never mind the protections that were built in, that will all go away. We're just going to become an even larger producer of oil and gas. And by the way, the legislation moving us into electric vehicles is also going to be nixed, according to him. In any event, climate change also has something to do with the violence in many countries because people have lost their capacity to produce whatever they were growing agriculturally because of climate change. In some cases, this has led to famine. In other cases, it has led to people joining violent groups like ISIS to try to somehow do something. And in the third kind of case, it has led to refugees. And of course, then we know the violence that, for example, in the US is about to take place or has been threatened against refugees, many of whom are economic refugees. And as I've mentioned in previous lectures, the whole edifice of international asylum law and so forth was premised in post-World War II period of people who were escaping political and religious harassment and potential death, and did not really accommodate economic refugees, which more and more of the refugees in the world are in fact economic refugees. That notion of violence spilling outside of countries, not only violence inside countries introduced by their own governments or outside forces, but violence in terms of people trying to seek refuge somewhere, of course, has also enhanced violence. You no doubt hear and read about, the refugees who are caught in the Caribbean and who drown, or in the English Channel and so forth. So those are not actually the cause of sort of military or political conflicts in countries, but often are at the margin between those and conflicts which arise due to climate change, which, as I mentioned, isn't particularly focused upon. So, as I said, you have at least 20 countries where the conflict is in fact inside the countries, and we have that's about 10% of the world's countries. And you also have conflicts which are not, classified in the historical fashion, from civil wars and ethnic conflicts and so forth, but that some of these are in fact caused by the incapacity of people to continue to live and produce and survive wherever they happen to be living. And that is sometimes the result of a conflict or a war, but increasingly the consequence of climate change of one kind or another. Now, I want to say two more things about this. And one of them is, of course, when there's violence and when there's killing, sometimes it's very basic. I mean, somebody just, knifes somebody. But a lot of it, of course, uses weapons. And then the question is, where do people get the weapons from? And for example, Israel's conflict with Gaza, much of the weaponry comes from the United States. And the US is the largest producer of arms in the world. And the arms industry in the United States is obviously in very good shape. They are producing at limit. Much of it being shipped abroad, not just to Israel, but sold to other countries. Much of it on the black market, and the moguls, may I call them that, who run the arms industry in the United States, are in very good relationship with the incoming president, who is surrounded by the economic elite of this country, and therefore will do very little, I would imagine, to slow down U.S. arms sale. If anything, he will encourage more arms sale to whoever is interested. And then, of course, you say, well, that can't be true because, for example, we're not selling arms to, let's say, Iran, or for that matter, Russia. But I would say to you, not so fast, because both of those countries managed to get arms through third parties, some of which are produced by the United States, and also are, of course, encouraged by having access to arms from other countries, for example, in the case of Russia, North Korea, and China to some extent, so that there is a big arms market out there. But of course, the major conflicts, which use massive weapons, like those huge American bombs, those are not randomly owned by everybody and shipped around. I mean, the US has provided Israel with the major arms, big bombs and so forth, which have decimated Gaza. But the other thing is that much of the violence in the world nowadays comes from not major weapon systems, but rather missiles and smaller weapons of one kind or another, which can be manufactured much more easily locally. Not to mention drones, of course, which is a new weapon which, easily can kill a whole bunch of people. And drones are not that difficult to manufacture, so that various kinds of violent groups in the world, which are engaged in violence in, as I said, places like Mozambique, Angola, and in West Africa, and in various other places in Asia, Pakistan to some extent, increasingly maybe in Indonesia, and so on. A lot of harm can be done by drones. So when we talk about violence, we're not just talking about very major military installations and weapons. We're also talking about drones and to some extent missiles, which are much easier to produce. And finally, or not finally actually, it is, of course, very easy for anybody to get hold of rifles and hand weapons of one kind or another. You can buy them online, and as we've learned recently in our own news, you can either even manufacture and produce them on your computers and printers and so forth. So that lots of small acts of violence in various parts of the world, which are very harmful to the local population, are in fact carried out not with major weapon systems, but with people carrying guns and rifles who just, shoot down 20 people in this village and 50 people in that village. So that is also, in that negligible capacity for violence and for killing. So there's a lot of killing going on in the world, and any little group or subgroup in any country that's unhappy can arm itself. And so while we don't hear too much about many of the violence in the world on a daily basis, we are in fact living in a very, very violent world right now. And you can imagine this sort of as a, pyramid on top, our nuclear weapons and major bombs and major air capacity and so forth, which is held by relatively few countries. But underneath then are weapon systems that are easily capable of wiping out millions of people and or maiming millions of people. And there are all these gradations of weapons that I have just gone through. And I haven't even mentioned things like germ warfare and chemical warfare, which is also available to a remarkable number of people, if not in the sense that they actually produce them, but in the sense that they can be marketed by countries who wish to help other countries engage in violence. Looked at from the perspective of the total world population, this is a time not just that we know about worldwide violence and anticipate and are concerned about other violence, like let's say Ukraine, let's say Russia takes over Ukraine and we get West Europe involved and East Europe involved and so forth. I'm not even necessarily talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that the billions of people in the world, many of them confront directly and indirectly the capacity of either their governments or subgroups in their society to engage in pretty serious violence and prove destabilizing for that particular country. And destabilizing countries, even by having sort of civil conflicts, of course, also means destabilizing the economy. It's not just loss of life and injury, it is also destabilizing economies. So, for example, the Sudan, which I mentioned before, it is assumed that there are at least a couple of million people who are on the margin of starvation, right? And in Gaza, unless these trucks are now arriving because of the interregnum of conflict there, but while they were not arriving, people and children actually starved of famine. So that is also a form of violence, if you will, though it's not normally quantified of violence. Now, why is this all going on? Is it not really going on, and only because I'm making a big deal out of it because we can watch it now on TV and we can learn about it through the internet? Or is there, in fact, probably more violence going on in the world and more people getting killed through the violence than was, let's say, the case some years back? And I would argue, excuse me, the answer is actually yes. And then the question is, why was a world that was set up to stop violence and to mediate violence when it occurs not functioning? Well, we have NATO, and it seemingly is still acting as a deterrence, but it may not always. But in the rest of the world, various kinds of alliances and conflict management institutions have eroded. What is even more serious is that the United Nations were a strong component of the UN, not just the Security Council, but the peacekeeping and peacekeepers and all sorts of institutional, monetary, and central institutions of the UN in New York, but also other institutions, the International Atomic Energy Commission and UNESCO and World Health, and all these institutions were meant to act preventively to manage or deter conflict, or to help manage it when humans in non-negligible numbers were potentially at risk. And none of these institutions are functioning properly right now. For example, you're not hearing about UN peacekeepers going to, let's say, Mozambique. You have heard that UN peacekeepers are going to Haiti, which is a horrendous killing machine right now. And they're from Kenya, and they're not able to do very much of anything. Essentially, the idea of peacekeeping was to keep the peace once peace had broken out, for example, to keep conflicting people at bay from each other or at borders. That ceased a long time ago. Peacekeepers increasingly were meant to help create the peace in the Congo, in Haiti, and so forth. And that hasn't been financed properly, and that hasn't been not only not financed, but most countries in the world are not anxious to send their nationals to go into the fray and get killed overseas in hopeless conflicts, especially when they're not going to be well trained and well funded, and the funds in the UN for doing these things no longer exist. Nor does the will to intervene exist, even if you could imagine that peacekeeping could be stepped up. For example, the Security Council, with its current veto system and current membership, has no way of stopping conflicts. I mean, every time the Security Council took up the Gaza conflict, the US vetoed any possibility until very recently. It approved one or two things, but basically we constantly vetoed the idea that the UN should get involved. And historically, Russia, and with its ally usually China, has vetoed almost all legislation which would have been enabling for the United Nations to step in, to fund things, to send peacekeepers, to negotiate, and so forth. So that the entire post-World War II structure, which was meant to monitor, to prevent, to ensure when there was a peace agreement that peace would be kept, that entire post-World War II structure has basically, if it hasn't completely disintegrated on paper, has disintegrated in a major way. I mean, the UN Secretary General can get up there every Monday and plead for the conflict in the middle in Gaza to stop, but nobody particularly pays any attention to him. So we no longer have international machinery which really works. And who was at the forefront of helping to build and fund the machinery, both in the concrete sense, also in the policy and psychological sense? It was, of course, the United States, which under our new administration has, of course, threatened to even get out of NATO, although that may not actually happen, but doesn't believe in any of it. It's America first. We're the most powerful country in the world. We will protect our borders. We protect ourselves from, trade. Everything in the world has been unfair with respect to the United States. And now we're going to, be hardline America first, borders and so forth, and we won't, mess with any of this. It appears to be the case. And furthermore, we may actually start conflicts because, when we are wronged, we will start conflicts. For example, the idea of forcefully taking over the Panama Canal or something like that. So in terms of violence, we are, I think, or by we, I mean the world and the world population, probably in the worst place that we have been since the Second World War. Now, you can very quickly say we have confronted possibilities of nuclear conflicts before. And in that sense, it may not be the worst time in the world with respect to violence, because at the moment, at least, nobody seems to be ready to have a nuclear conflict or nuclear war. But in terms of the number of people dying, affected, lives ruined, malnourished, dying from famine, trying to leave the countries, to go somewhere where they can make a living and they can survive, when all countries are putting up borders against asylum seekers and immigrants, legal and immigrants. It hasn't been worse. That is to say, there have been historical periods where large numbers of immigrants came, Second World War, Vietnam War, and so forth. But the idea that there were maybe half the countries in the world where people felt they had no future, or their lives were at risk and they needed to go somewhere else, and where increasingly climate change will make this worse, we are in a very bad place, because we have not the institutions that can kick in and manage the worst of this. We have no leadership from either the United States or, for that matter, China, to address some of the reasons why people need to feel they need to leave. We have a world in which, in the next decade, our notion of America first, and we're not going to be impacted by anything else, is, of course, total nonsense. First, in terms of the kind of world we live in. Second, the fact that we live in an increasingly violent world, which impacts us. Third, we live in an increasingly violent world, which means that people simply are panicked, needing to get out from wherever they live to a better place. And it's one thing to say we were going to get rid of 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States. But first of all, of course, it's not consistent with American law to do so. And second of all, where are these people going to go? And just dumping them back into countries where they've come from is not viable under any kind of ethical or moral standards. Do you really want to send the Rohingyas back to Myanmar where they're going to get killed? Do you really want to, ship starving people back to more starvation? Or are you happy that they're going to sink because then you don't have to bother with them? We are, I would say, in a very dire place in terms of the actual and potential violence in the world. And it seems to me, both on the local, on the state, and on the national level, those who do not approve the current administration's policies, or some of their policies, need to think good and hard about who and what should be supported, and how we might be able in 4 years' time to be a better actor in the world in terms of battening down the causes of violence in so many parts of the world. And that means doing something about poverty, but it also means doing something about climate change, which also feeds into the impoverishment, but also not being the role model for the role we have played right now in the Middle East, as thinking that it's okay to kill, and maim a substantial part of the population of a country in order to rectify the very unfortunate death of some of your own nationals. I've gone over time a little bit, but what I would like to encourage us all is not to just get depressed about what's going on in our own country right now, but to put shoulder to the wheel of trying to resist the worst of it, but also to start thinking creatively, who and what do we want to support to try to move sometime in this century to a less violent time. Violence caused by climate change, violence caused by conflicts, violence caused by people who've come to the end of their rope and don't know where to turn. Thank you very much, and hopefully the next time I'll have a more cheerful topic.